نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh Al-Maram min Adilat Al-Ahkam by Hafiz Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, and this particular book that it covers hadith that relates to Hadith Al-Ahkam. So we have been discussing Kitab Al-Tahara or Bab or Kitab Al-Tahara, and discussing in specific in this book matter that relates to Al-Ghusl wa Ahkam Al-Junub. So inshallah ta'ala we have one hadith that remain in this particular chapter. So the hadith will be read and then we'll have a discussion relating to this particular hadith, or two hadith that the author ends with in this particular chapter. Naam, tafaddal.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. Hadith 108. Narrated Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, "There is sexual impurity under every hair. So wash the hair and cleanse the skin." Reported by Abu Dawud and at-Tirmidhi, who had rated it da'if, weak. Ahmed has something similar from the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, and in the chain is one narrator who is majhul, someone whose credibility is not confirmed.
Naam, so that's the hadith that the author mentioned as in ending this particular discussion regarding ahkam that relates to al-ghusl and also janabah. So as for the hadith that is read, he mentioned the hadith, two hadith. One hadith, the hadith of Abu Hurairah, and as he mentioned here, and Abi Hurairah رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن تحت كل شهرة جنابة فاغسلوا الشعر وأنقوا البشر. رواه أبو داود والترمذي وضعفه. Then he mentioned ولي أحمد أن عائشة نحوي وفيه راوي مجهول. So that's called, so the author rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned that he mentioned here two hadith, the first hadith of Abu Hurairah and then the second hadith of Aisha, but both hadith somewhat discussing the same matter. So he mentioned nahwu, that is something, the hadith is similar to the first hadith, the hadith of Aisha. There's a second hadith that is similar to the hadith that was mentioned previous. So regarding concerning the matter, regarding this discussion, regarding this hadith, that we discussed concerning the takhrij of the hadith that have been mentioned, both hadith, we mentioned both hadith regarding takhrij. So starting the first hadith regarding the hadith of Abi Hurairah radiallahu anhu, where the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned this hadith, that he said the hadith رواه Abu Dawud والترمذي. So it is stated here by Sheikh Mahir Al-Fahl in his checking of the book of Bulugh Al-Maram, when he mentioned this hadith of Abu Hurairah, he said the hadith isnaduhu daif, that he mentioned isnaduhu daif, and also that has been somewhat mentioned by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala da'afahu. He mentions that Abu Dawud with Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, that they all hadith to be daif. So he mentioned isnadu daif. Then he went into discussing the reason behind why this hadith is said to be daif. But overall, we'll discuss that matter further. Then he mentioned the hadith can be found with Abu Dawud in his Sunan, also the hadith in that Tirmidhi, as the author have mentioned in his Al-Jami'. Also the hadith can be found in Ibn Majah and Bayhaqi. So these are the sort that have been mentioned here by way of Sheikh Mahir. So he mentioned the hadith that has been the first hadith of Abu Hurairah. It is found in Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi, wal Bayhaqi. Then as we mentioned, that he stated the hadith is da'if, and he stated the reason for this, للضعف Al-Harith ibn Wajih. So Abid ibn Wajih, one of the narrators, that there's some discussion regarding him, and so he mentioned that that's the reason behind the hadith is graded as daif. Others who have mentioned this particular hadith of when this hadith is mentioned, that that they state regarding of takhrij of the source of this hadith, that this particular hadith that can be found in Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Bayhaqi. Also they mention Al-Baghawi in his book Sharh Sunnah, and others mention others. So this hadith is mentioned in those books, and the hadith considered to be daif. As for the reason behind the hadith that is daif, why the hadith is stated to be da'if. It is mentioned here by Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan. When he mentions hadith, he called concern that he mentioned the isnad, qala Abu Dawud. So regarding the criticism of this hadith, that he mentioned a chain of hadith, that he mentioned that this particular hadith that is in the Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, wa Ibn Majah, kulluhum min tariq Nasr ibn Ali, that the chain of this isnad all goes back to Nasr, it goes back to Nasr ibn Ali. قال حدثنا الحارث ibn وجيه قال حدثنا مالك ibn دينار and Muhammad ibn Sirin and Abi Hurairah رضي الله عنه به مرفوعا. So that's the hadith that they mentioned, that's the isnad of the hadith. So they mentioned regarding concerning this hadith that Abu Dawud as-Sijistani, he mentioned, well, he stated this hadith, he stated, Al-Harith ibn Wajih hadithuhu munkar wa huwa daif. So he mentioned that this hadith is munkar and also that is also weak. Then so he mentioned that the hadith al-munkar and that munkar regarding tafarrud. So as we had mentioned, so in ilm mustalah regarding hadith being munkar, at times being concerned at the hadith that it is tafarrud, that one of the narrators that is the sole narrator of this hadith, so it is referred to as munkar at times, or khata, or an error that have occurred by way of the narrator. So munkar with the ulama of hadith that indicate something that an error has occurred an error have occurred, and also at times tafarrud upon that have occurred in the hadith. So they mentioned that Al-Harith, that is the only one of narrated this hadith as stated by some, and it mentioned that based upon this, that he is not considered to be reliable. He is not considered to be reliable as regarding his narration. As for at-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned hadith Harith ibn Wajih, hadith gharib, hadithun gharib. So at-Tirmidhi, when he mentioned this hadith that he stated concerning at-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah ta'ala, when he mentioned the hadith that he'll pass his judgment on the hadith, he'll pass his ruling or judgment on the hadith. So when he state this hadith of passing his judgment, he say, hadith Harith ibn Wajih, hadith gharib. So the ulama have clarified that at-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah ta'ala, that when he mentioned hadith, he had different mustalahat, he had different terminologies that he used. Of the time, of those terminologies that he used, the word gharib, hadithun gharib, as in this case. What they have indicated or what they have mentioned as to what is meant by at-Tirmidhi when he mentioned hadithun gharib, hadithun daif. So at-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah ta'ala, the word al-gharib, hadith gharib, by itself, then indicate that a hadith is that they mention وَلَا نَعْرِفَهُ إِلَّا مِنْ حَدِيثِ, and we do not know this hadith except from his hadith of which is Al-Harith. And as we mentioned, that Harith is said to yatafarrud, that is the only single narrator who have narrated this hadith on his sheikh. So based upon this and this kalam regarding him, then he mentioned that وهو شيخ ليس بذاك, so they mentioned he's a sheikh ليس بذاك, وقد روى عنه غير واحد من الأئمة وقد تفرد بهذا حديث عن مالك من دينار. Then he stayed concerned that فقد تفرد, that Al-Harith ibn Wajih, that he has tafarrud, that he is the single only narrator on Malik ibn Dinar with this hadith. So it's tafarrud and also is on the discussion. So you find the ulama have somewhat spoken about this hadith, and those who have criticized this hadith, that Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala also have discussed this narrator and others. So many who have discussed this narrator, Al-Bukhari, that the ulama have somewhat weakened the hadith of Al-Harith ibn Wajih. That and it is stated that this is the only hadith that he have narrated in Kutub al-Sittah. So this narrator, that is the only hadith that he has narrated in the books of Kutub al-Sittah. So by this they mentioned that an Ibn Ma'in أنه قال فيه ليس بشيء, that Ibn Ma'in, Yahya ibn Ma'in rahimahullah ta'ala, have mentioned that ليس بشيء is nothing, as a way of saying that he is a weak narrator. Also they mentioned قال Bukhari, that Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned في حديثه بعد مناكير, that in his hadith there's thing which is manakir, there's thing which is indicating that there's weakness in his hadith. So An-Nasahi كذلك I've also mentioned daif, and also Uqayli I've mentioned regarding annahu. So also Uqayli and others who have and also Ibn Abi Hatim, Bayhaqi, that many of the ulama of hadith, many of the ulama of hadith, that they are somewhat pointed out that this particular narrator, Harith ibn Wajih, that is someone who's daif. And also is narration is manakir. And also with this, that in this particular hadith, that is tafarrud. That they mention it, is tafarrud, is the only narrator upon this. So based upon this, that this hadith, that they have mentioned that Al-Bayhaqi قال أنكره أهل العلم بالحديث Al-Bukhari, Abu Dawud, وغيرهما, that you find that ulama of hadith have somewhat have criticized this, the particular narrator, and he mentioned that إنما يروي عن حسن النبي عليه السلام مرسلة, that some of his narration upon the Prophet عليه السلام, it is mursal, upon Hassan it is mursal. And also they mentioned وعن حسن and Abu Hurairah موقوفا. So this particular narrator is said to be da'if regarding what had been said by the hadith as mentioned by Ibn Hajar. And also the second hadith of Aisha anhu, that he mentioned that the hadith is similar but didn't mention the wording of the hadith. So Ibn Hajar mentioned that this hadith of Aisha that comes after the hadith of Abu Hurairah, that they're very similar. So he mentioned the hadith of Abu Hurairah and did not mention the hadith of Aisha. So with this, ulama mentioned that this hadith of Abu Hurairah, of Aisha, that it is that he mentioned that hadith in the Ahmed. We mentioned Lil Ahmed and Aisha Nahwi or Nahu وفيه راو مجهول, that also indicates that this hadith also is daif. That I mentioned that that Ibn Hajar passed in that judgment of hadith, that they have mentioned that inside this this hadith, that is a narrator that is called Khusayf. So Khusayf is inside this. So Khusayf is one of the narrator that is on the question this hadith. So they mentioned regarding concerns Ahmed, that Al-Haythami in his book Majmu' al-Zawahid, when he mentioned this hadith, قال رواه أحمد ورجاله رجال الصحيح إلا. So Al-Haythami, when he mentioned this hadith, called رواه أحمد, that this hadith is narrated by Ahmed or collected by Ahmed. وَرِجَالُهُ رِجَال Sahih, and it's Rijal, the narrators, they are the narrators of Sahih. They mention إِلَّا أَنَّ فِيهِ رَجُلًا لَمْ يُسَمْ, that is a person that is not mentioned or not named. So it's someone in an isnad that is not named, indicating the hadith is daif. So they mentioned that also that narrator, also another of the ilal of the hadith, فيه خسيف. Who is Khusayf? هو خسيف ibn Abdul Rahman Jazari, صدوق سيء الإف خلط بآخره آخرة, that also is said to be of those who that is صدوق سيء الإف. So someone who said to be صدوق, that's of the people that said not of the level of hadith Hassan, but سيء الإف. But also تغير, also he can start في اختلاط, that at in his older age he start to lose of his memory. So they mention that is اختلاط خلط بآخره. So that indicate that he start to lose of his memory, loss of his memory. Also in the hadith of another narrator called الشريك والشريك ibn Abdullah النخعي القاضي صدوق يؤتي كثيرا. So that's also another reason regarding concerning, I mentioned تغير حفظه, that Sharik, that his memory somewhat was affected, something got started up errors regarding his memory. منذ تولى القضاء بالكوفة. So upon, so that he used to know a person that was a sharp memory, but when he took the job, the position of being a qadi, then his memory started to change, start to change. So they mentioned regarding concern that it showed that that at times that one, that the first narrator Khasif, that he lost his memory because of older age as he got older, but also Sharik, that his memory became poor as he after taking the office of a judge. So that certain responsibility can have a toll upon a person. So having certain responsibility can have a toll upon a person. So that impacted upon Sharik ibn Abdullah regarding his memory, whereas he became a judge, still rajul credible, but his weakness occurred in his memory, and at some time due to regarding that most time then spent in qada, and also the things that he has to deal with. But overall, they mention the hadith is daif. So overall, those two hadith are said to be daif. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, that in ending of this book, he end with those two hadith, the hadith of Abu Hurairah and also the hadith of Al-Aisha, both of whom are said to be hadith that are daif. So mention that Ad-Daraqutni and others of the ulama, Uqayli, of Al-Bukhari, Abu Dawud, who have weakened the hadith of Abu Hurairah, and also the second hadith of Aisha, that the ulama also have mentioned the same. As for the wording of this hadith of Aisha, that she mentioned the hadith at her hadith, the wording of her hadith, it states, Ajmartu sha'ri ijmaran shadid. Meaning concerns that she kind of like she dyed her hair with very so she dyed her hair and it became very hot. She dyed her hair, it became very hot. فقال لي رسول عليه السلام, so the Prophet عليه السلام, he said to her, يا عائشة, O Aisha, أما علمت أن على كل شعر جنابة. So that's the part that I need to mention that, you know, يا عائشة, أما علمت أن على كل شهر Janabah, that for every hair that the person, that the entire body to be washed, and every so in the entire body to be washed, and all the hair on the body to be washed. So that's concerning the hadith that is mentioned here. So that's the hadith that is mentioned. There's another hadith that is said to be a hadith that can be a shahid to the hadith of Aisha, with the hadith of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, that hadith in the Ibn Majah, where the Prophet ﷺ said in this hadith, as-salawatul khams wal-jum'a ila jum'a wa ada al-amana kafara lima baynahuma qultu wa ma ada al-amana. So the hadith mentioned that the 5 prayers, and from Juma to Juma, and also giving of the amana, fulfillment of the amana, the trust, that it will expiate between these things. Then it was said to him, it was asked, wa ma ada al-amana, what is the person giving fulfillment of the trust? قال, then the Prophet ﷺ, he responded by saying, غسل الجنابة فإن تحت كل شهر جنابة. That he mentioned that what is said to be amana, fulfillment of the amana, he mentioned غسل janaba, the person performing al-ghusl for janaba. And second, and he mentioned, then he stated, إن تحت كل شهر janaba, that for every part of the body to be washed, that every hair on the body to be washed. So that's concerning that this hadith. This hadith also, the ulama have mentioned the hadith is da'if. So a discussion of the ulama who have da'af, the ulama all this hadith to be da'if. So overall, that these are some of the hadith relating to that particular discussion. So that's concerning those hadith that relates to this discussion regarding what is stated regarding the hukum of the hadith. So overall, that hadith, the meaning of the hadith regarding this, the meaning of the hadith is stating regarding that all the everything on the body to be washed. So the entire body to be washed, even the hair on the body, that they are also to be washed. In the person performing janabah. So the person performing janabah, then the person should wash everything on their body. So the ulama mentioned that those with external and internal, that external regarding the entire body, physical body to be washed. So the entire body to be washed. And if there's also any hair, also the person ensure that water gets to those hair and reach the actual skin of the body. So with this hadith of the ahkam that is taken from the hadith that Sheikh they have mentioned regarding concern that, you know, the ahkam of this hadith that it shows regarding concerns the hadith that as mentioned by Sheikh Bassam, that mentioned the hadith, it proves regarding that hadith dalil ala wujub ghusl min janabah, that a person performing ghusl afa janabah. And also from the hadith ta'mim al-jasam, that also a person to wash his entire body. So the entire body to be washed, as they say, from head to toe of the body to be washed in performing of ghusl. And also if there's hair on the body, also water gets to the hair and cover the body. So that's the hadith and what is discussed regarding this particular matter. That the hadith, even though the hadith is said to be, the hadith is ruled to be da'if, but regarding, as we had mentioned before, that there's numerous hadith that we have covered before indicating that the person, as one of the conditions for al-ghusl, that a person washes his entire body. And we have covered so even though the hadith is da'if, but what can be extracted or taken from the hadith, it is correct by the person performing ghusl is to ensure that his entire body is washed. The entire body is washed. So that's concerning. So that's what is mentioned regarding this particular hadith. This is a discussion regarding concern with this hadith that can be, as we have that it mentioned that the person in washing and ensuring that the hair being washed. So I said, no, so the person have hair on his body or on the head, that ensure that that water touches the entire hair and the entire body. So from this hadith, I mentioned that the ulama discuss if a person have excessive hair on their body. So that is a woman that has long hair, a man may have long hair, and they take in a ghusl. Do they need to ensure that the entire hair, the long hair, that also it is washed, or water is poured on it? So water being poured over the hair, if one have long hair, is this something that is a part of the ghusl, or what's the ruling regarding this? So in this matter, that as we mentioned before, the person, so we have discussed before regarding the person uncombing of their hair, that's not wajib, or to unbraid their hair, unplait of their hair, that's not wajib according to Jumhur of the ulama. But if the person have long hair, nam, in this case, is the person, then what is required from the person who has long hair, male or female, male or female. On this matter, regarding water, washing of the long hair, the ulama in this, they have two positions. So, ala qawlain. So the first position of the ulama, yajib ghuslu, that it is compulsory for the person to wash this hair. Yajib ghusla. So it is compulsory for the person to wash that extended hair, or the long hair. It's a must to be washed, and that's the position taken by Imam Shafi, and also عليه ashab, and also of some of the ulama of the Hanabila. So Shafi and also the ulama, some of the ulama of the Hanabila take this position that the person who has long hair, a lady, a woman, or even a man that has long hair, then it is to be washed. It is, and it's compulsory to be washed. The second opinion take the position as la yajib. It is not compulsory for the person to wash this hair, the extended and the long hair. Not the person that needs to get the water to the root of his hair and to his head to make sure the water reaches the skull or the head. Then it mentions that what is wajib, anything below what is the extended hair, that is something which said that it is not a must to wash it. So it's something which is allowed but is not compulsory. So it is something which is allowed but not compulsory. And that's a view taken by the Hanafiya, the Malikiya, and some of the Hanabila, that take the position that the long hair, that it is not compulsory, that everything has to be washed. That's the position taken by the Hanafi, the Malikiya, and also some of the Hanabila. And also I mentioned that Ibn Qudama is more lenient towards this view. Ibn Qudama is more in defense, more for the second opinion, that it is not compulsory to wash the long hair. And as I mentioned regarding concern, the evidence that they use regarding that matter is the hadith, hadith of Salama that we had mentioned before, the hadith of Salama that have been mentioned before. So that hadith, we covered that hadith of Salama that we had mentioned regarding the Prophet concerning that washing off the mentioned sha'r ras. That so I mentioned that hadith mentioned about the water getting to the skull, but not necessarily the water have to wash the entire long hair, based upon that opinion. And also that the person undoing of the hair, it is not a must. The main thing, the water get into the hair and get into the skull. So with that, those aqwal of the ulama, Allahu alam, that regarding concern that the first opinion, that is wajib, that is ahwat. The first opinion that the person washing even the long hair, the extended hair, that is something which is ahwat in these two aqwal. It is the preferred position, or the safer way for a person to get out of the khilaf. So for a person, that the safer route is for a person to wash the entire hair. That's the safer route taken by those who say it is compulsory. As for the second opinion, they say it is la yajib, then that is, of the mentioned, that call seems more arjah, more correct, but the first opinion is safer. So the first opinion is safer in according to some of the ulama, even though some may take the second position, that it is the more arjah, the more correct view, but the first opinion is the more safer route to take. So this hadith that we have now completed this hadith that author Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala have mentioned in the bab of ghusl wa ahkam al-junub. So with this now he had ended, we have mentioned over 18 hadith. So he mentioned 18 hadith, some might 18 hadith in total in this particular chapter regarding matter pertaining to al-ghusl. So he mentioned mainly in summary that he mentioned, so the ulama mentioned regarding concerning with, so he mentioned a hadith regarding al-ghusl with janabah. Matters regarding al-hayd wa nifas will be discussed later. So matters regarding al-hayd wa nifas will be covered later, as that's a separate chapter. So this particular bab of al-ghusl more intended regarding janabah and other and cases and some other cases they have mentioned. So regarding concerning al-ghusl, so regarding we have discussed concerning al-ghusl and its ahkam and the case of janabah in particular. So we have mentioned that al-ghusl, what is meant by ghusl, and we have covered that matter, that istilahan wa shar'an or lugatan wa shar'an, what is meant by al-ghusl. Then also we have discussed regarding mujibat al-ghusl, under what circumstance is one to perform al-ghusl. Of those things the author have mentioned, the hadith have mentioned regarding that khuruj al-mani, so the person who have discharge of any form of mani and is awake, or if the person was to have ihtilam, or the person is having a wet dream. So if there's khuruj of mani, the person, then the person perform al-ghusl. Except the person, in case I make an exception regarding a person who's ill, those cases are exception, but under normal circumstance, that a person have any form of discharge of mani, then the person perform al-ghusl. The person is awake, or by way of dreaming, of a wet dream, and there's also a wet dream that he did see that the residue of mani regarding wetness or dampness, then that's an indication that there was a discharge. So in that case, the person perform al-ghusl. Also, he discussed regarding the case of jima, as they mentioned regarding concerning iltiqa khitanain, that in the case we're concerned that the two private areas of meat, and the ulama mentioned regarding that in any case of jima, of the two, the person one entering another, a male entering a female, then in that case jima. And even others mentioned that also if it will occur from behind, yadu billah. So even if it will occur from behind, penetration from behind, from in a dubur, then even though that is something which is to be discussed, not allowed, but if it is done, then that is considered to be also ghusl is required. Then they discuss also the al-jima, where the person in penetration, where the person did have a discharge or ejaculated or not. So whether there was a discharge in by way of intimacy. So in any case the person have done penetration, then ghusl is required. Then the next case that they discuss, that author discussed regarding a person that may have accepted Islam. So a person accept Islam, return back to Islam, return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarding Islam, then that person, is it compulsory upon them to perform ghusl or not? That khilaf between the ulama, those who say it is compulsory, those who say it is not. But awla, for a person to do so, then it's best for a person to do so. Then they discuss matter regarding al-jum'ah. So in the case of Jum'ah, is it from something which is wajib in attending of Jum'ah for one to perform ghusl or not? Again, a lengthy discussion between the ulama, but he mentioned a hadith regarding al-ghusl. Allahu alam, the qawl seem to the aqwal that Jum'ah, ghusl is wajib for Jum'ah. Ghusl is wajib for Jum'ah for anyone who attend Jum'ah. Then also they discuss regarding al-ghusl, regarding al-maut, or al-mayt. So the person who passed away, then that person is deserving al-ghusl. And that to be discussed again in Babel Janaza, but overall regarding the person who have passed away, the deceased Muslim, then he's deserving to have a ghusl. And that's fard al-ain, that fard al-kifaya, as to be discussed at this place in Babel ghusl. Then also the one who have washed the deceased. So the one who was involved in preparing washing of the deceased, is that person perform al-ghusl. And we discussed regarding that, that's not the case. It's not wajib for a person to perform al-ghusl, and the hadith regarding that, we have mentioned those hadith and what have been said by the ulama regarding those hadith. Then also they discuss regarding a person regarding intimacy or wish to return ended intimacy and want to continue. Then it is mustahab or jaiz or mustahab for a person to perform ghusl again, then return. For the husband, that's for the husband. Then also we discuss sifat al-ghusl, and the ulama mentioned regarding sifat al-ghusl, that's of sifat al-ghusl of two types. Sifat ijza wa sifa al-kamal. So the sifat which is ijza, where it is the person do what is the compulsory components, what is wajib upon them regarding ghusl, the fara'id. Not doing everything, but that which is the primary components of ghusl, the primary acts of ghusl. So we discussed regarding concerning what is said by the ulama of the fara'id al-ghusl, that they all concerning one, a niyyah, the person of the intention as act of ibadah. Second, that the person, they discuss ta'mim al-badan bil-ma, that a person pour water over the entire body, so water is poured over the entire body. That is also compulsory. Then they mention on the matter regarding a third matter that they mentioned, al-madmada wa istinshaq, is the person washing his nose and mouth compulsory or not? And we discussed regarding the aqwal of the ulama on that matter. Regarding the person performing ghusl, does water need a person? Is it compulsory upon a person to wash his nose and mouth 3 times, or wash his nose and mouth? Then they mentioned of the matter that mawalat, that everything have to be consists that everything one after another. So with continuousness regarding those acts that they're all done simultaneous. So that aqwal of the ulama on that matter regarding the components where I said to be fara'id. So with this matter, then they mentioned, concerned the ulama mentioned regarding that ghusl, that there's things I've said of the sunnah acts of ghusl. So performing ghusl, the sunnah acts of ghusl, those acts will be considered of the sunnah act. That I mentioned that a khilaf between the ulama, as we stated, the person saying Bismillah at the start of a ghusl, is it a must or not? Then they mentioned al-wudu, the person then washing his hands up to the wrist 3 times. Then the person washing of the private area, removing of any form of anything that needs to be removed, and so the person washing of the private area and anything from his body. Then also washing of then making of wudu. So making of wudu. And in case of making of wudu, there's 2 methods of making wudu: a complete wudu from start to end, as the person would normally perform al wudu, and a second way is the person performing wudu, but delay washing of the feet. So everything is done in wudu with the exception of washing the feet, and that is done at the end. Then after making wudu, then the person will wash his entire body, pour water in his head 3 times, and then the entire body is washed. And also he will do so from right to left. The ulama have a khilaf regarding concerning in ghusl, that the person outside of the wudu, that the person need to wash his body, full body 3 times. They say as for the ras, that 3 times is sunnah to ensure for pouring water on his head, but for washing the entire body, that of the ulama mentioned that it is they see it as that once is enough, and doing it 3 times, they mentioned there's no evidence for this. That 3 times of washing the right and the left, there's no evidence for this. Then also we discuss that the person then a delk, the person also that rubbing over his body, also that is said to be of the sunnah act of wudu. So these are of those things that are related to al-ghusl. So that inshallah ta'ala, and as we mentioned also for the female in particular, that in a state of janabah, intimacy, or our haid at the end of her menstrual cycle, does she, if her hair is combed or plaited, does she need to undo those plait to perform ghusl, whether for haid or for janabah? It's like qawl al-jumhur of the ulama, it's not a must. Qawl al-jumhur, majority of the ulama, that mentioned it is not a must for her to do so. So based upon this, that those of the matter that relates to ahkam al-ghusl wal janabah, with that inshallah ta'ala, that will end this discussion and continue regarding the next chapter, which is at-tayammum. So what you cover next will bab at-tayammum. So that will be our next discussion. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخرة والحمد لله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.